Maya had lived for 347 years, yet she had never felt truly alive. She walked through the grand halls of the Crystal Kingdom with her head held high, her silver armor gleaming in the soft light that filtered through the towering windows. The other elves bowed respectfully as she passed, their eyes filled with admiration and fear. She was their greatest warrior, their protector, the one they called upon when darkness threatened their peaceful realm. But when the halls emptied and the night fell silent, Maya found herself sitting alone in her chamber, staring out at the endless stars and wondering if there was more to existence than duty and endless repetition. The elven kingdoms had existed for thousands of years in a state of controlled perfection. Every stone was placed with precision, every law was followed without question, every elf knew their place in society. It was a world of order and beauty, but it was also a world without passion, without true connection, without the wild unpredictability that made life worth living. Maya had begun to notice this emptiness growing inside her like a shadow spreading across the land. She watched other elves move through their lives with a kind of mechanical grace, performing their roles as if they were actors in an endless play. One evening, as Maya sat in the grand library surrounded by thousands of ancient texts, she came across a book that had been sealed away for centuries. The cover was bound in dragon leather, and the pages were yellowed with age. The title read The Lost Dragons of Valorith. Her hands trembled as she opened it, reading accounts of magnificent creatures that had once soared through the skies above the elven kingdoms. According to the texts, these dragons had been imprisoned or destroyed during a great war that had taken place so long ago that most elves had forgotten it ever happened. The more Maya read, the more fascinated she became. The dragons described in these ancient pages were not the mindless beasts that modern elves believed them to be. They were intelligent, noble creatures with their own cultures and societies. They had been hunted and captured because they were different, because they represented something wild and untamed that the early elven leaders could not control. Maya realized that she had spent her entire life defending a kingdom that had built its peace upon the imprisonment and destruction of innocent beings. That night, Maya made a decision that would change everything. She would venture into the Forbidden Caverns, a place that had been sealed off from the rest of the kingdom for over 1,000 years. The entrance was hidden deep within the shattered mountains, accessible only through dangerous passes that few elves had ever dared to traverse. The Elven Council had declared the caverns off-limits, warning that ancient evils dwelt within their depths. But Maya had begun to suspect that what the Council called evil was simply the cry of a creature that wanted to be free. She packed minimal supplies, taking only her sword, a cloak to shield her from the cold mountain air, and a small bag of provisions. She told no one of her plans. If she had revealed her intentions to the council, they would have stopped her immediately. They would have tried to convince her that she was mad, that the caverns held only danger and despair. But Maya had made peace with the idea that she might die in those dark passages. Anything would be better than continuing to exist in this hollow kingdom, where she was valued only for her ability to fight and kill. The journey to the shattered mountains took 3 days of hard travel. Maya moved swiftly, using her elven strength and speed to cover great distances. She passed through forests and across rivers, avoiding the main roads where other elves might see her and question her purpose. The closer she came to the Forbidden Land, the more the landscape changed. The grass grew sparse and gray, the trees became twisted and gnarled, and the very air seemed to whisper warnings. When she finally reached the entrance to the Forbidden Caverns, Maya understood why the ancient elves had sealed it away. The opening was enormous, a gaping mouth of darkness that seemed to swallow the sunlight itself. Strange symbols were carved into the stone around the entrance, symbols of binding and protection. These were not the marks of elves, but of something older and more primal. Maya placed her hand upon the cold stone and felt a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep within her chest. She crossed the threshold into darkness, and the world behind her seemed to fade away. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light, revealing walls of stone that glistened with moisture and something else, something that glowed with a faint bioluminescence. The cavern was alive in a way that the Crystal Kingdom could never be. She could hear the sound of water dripping in the distance, feel the presence of countless creatures moving through the shadows, sense the accumulated weight of thousands of years of trapped emotions and desperate hopes. Maya descended deeper and deeper into the earth, Hours passed as she navigated through narrow passages and vast chambers. Some of the tunnels were so small that she had to crawl on her hands and knees. Others opened into enormous voids where her footsteps echoed endlessly, and she could hear strange calls and responses echoing from the darkness. She was not afraid. If anything, she felt more alive than she had in centuries. Here in this forbidden place, she was finally far enough away from the suffocating order of the elven kingdoms. As she ventured deeper, Maya began to notice signs of habitation. There were scratch marks on the walls that looked like they had been made by massive claws. There were bones scattered across the cavern floor, bleached white and enormous. And there were chains, great lengths of thick metal that disappeared into the darkness. Someone or something had chained creatures down here, binding them in the depths where no light could reach them. The chains told stories of captivity and suffering that made Maya's heart ache with sympathy. Then she heard it, a sound so profound and filled with such sorrow that Maya had to sit down to process what she was hearing. It was a song or perhaps a lament, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth itself. The voice behind that sound was ancient and powerful, filled with memories of lost freedom and endless imprisonment. Maya followed the sound without hesitation, moving through passages that grew warmer with each step she took. The air began to smell of smoke and sulfur, and a faint orange glow appeared in the darkness ahead. When Maya emerged into the vast central chamber, she was struck speechless. Before her lay an impossible landscape, a cavern so enormous that she could not see its ceiling. Rivers of molten lava flowed across the stone floor, creating rivers of liquid gold and red. The walls were lined with massive crystals that caught and refracted the heat, creating an intricate pattern of light and shadow. And in the center of this magnificent underground world lay a dragon. The creature was absolutely enormous, at least 200 feet in length from the tip of its snout to the end of its tail. Its scales shimmered with deep crimsons and rich violets, colors that seemed to shift and change in the light of the molten lava. The dragon's wings were folded against its back, each feather larger than Maya herself. Its eyes were closed, but as Maya stepped forward, they opened slowly, revealing irises that burned like molten gold. Maya felt something happen inside her consciousness, a sudden expansion of awareness that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The dragon was looking at her, truly seeing her, not as a threat or an intruder, but as something far more significant. She heard a voice inside her mind, ancient and powerful, speaking words in a language she had never learned but somehow understood perfectly. The dragon's name came to her like a revelation. She was Azura, the Blood Queen, last of the true dragons of Valarith, imprisoned in these caverns for 5,000 years. The moment their minds touched, Maya understood everything. Images flooded her consciousness like a tidal wave, showing her visions of a time when dragons soared freely through the skies above Valarith. She saw grand cities built within clouds, dragons playing and hunting together in perfect harmony with nature. She witnessed the slow descent into fear and misunderstanding, the moment when the early elven kingdoms began to see dragons as threats, rather than fellow intelligent beings. She felt the horror of the Great War, the betrayal, and finally the anguish of imprisonment. Azura had ruled a vast territory once, stretching across 3 continents. She had been a dragon of immense wisdom and power, respected and loved by thousands of her kind. But the elves had united against them, using ancient magic that had been passed down through generations. They had captured Azura along with many other dragons, binding them with magical chains that prevented them from transforming into their smaller flying forms. Over the centuries, most of the imprisoned dragons had died from despair and starvation. Azura alone had endured, sustained by an iron will and the refusal to surrender her spirit to the darkness. Maya moved closer to the great dragon, her small form dwarfed by the massive presence before her. She reached out her hand, and Azura lowered her enormous head, allowing the elf to touch her scales. The contact sent another wave of emotion through Maya, and she began to weep. She wept for the suffering that Azura had endured, for the innocent beings that had been destroyed, for the terrible sins of her own people. She wept because she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life, and she knew that it was already too late to save it from complete destruction. Through their connection, Azura asked Maya a single question that echoed through her mind. The dragon wanted to know if Maya had come to free her or to simply bear witness to her suffering. Maya looked up into those molten golden eyes and understood that she faced a choice that would determine the course of her entire existence. She could turn around right now, Walk back to the Crystal Kingdom and pretend that this moment had never happened. The council need never know that she had ventured into the forbidden caverns. Her life would continue as it always had, safe and ordered and empty, or she could attempt something that had never been done before. She could try to break the chains that bound Azura, knowing that such an action would be viewed as an act of treason against the entire Elven kingdom. She would become an outlaw, hunted by her own people. She would lose her position, her status, and quite possibly her life. But she would also be responsible for freeing one of the last great beings of magic in the world. She would give meaning to her existence in a way that duty and obedience could never achieve. Maya closed her eyes and reached deep within herself. Searching for the wellspring of magic that flowed through her elven blood, she had spent her entire life training her body to be a weapon, but she had neglected the magical abilities that lay dormant within her spirit. Now faced with the greatest challenge of her life, she understood that she had to access those forgotten powers. She began to chant in the old elven tongue, words of power and binding that she had read about in ancient texts but had never spoken aloud. The chains began to glow with an intense heat, the metal turning from gray to white to brilliant gold. Maya could feel the strain of channeling so much power through her body, but she did not stop. Sweat poured down her face and her entire form trembled with the effort. The molten rivers around them began to surge and swirl, responding to the magical disturbance. Azura rose to her feet, pulling against the chains with all of her considerable strength. The chains grew hotter and hotter, glowing with an intensity that forced Maya to shield her eyes. She heard a sound like thunder crack through the cavern, and then finally, the metal began to break apart. The chains shattered into fragments that scattered across the cavern floor, some pieces disappearing into the flowing lava. As the last chain fell away, Azura released a roar that was so powerful it caused the very earth to shake. Centuries of captivity had come to an end. Azura stretched her massive body for the first time in thousands of years, extending her wings to their full span. The wings were so enormous that they seemed to fill the entire chamber, blocking out the light from the crystal walls and the molten rivers. The dragon's muscles rippled beneath her scales as she moved, and Maya realized that despite her age and imprisonment, Azura was still in perfect physical condition. Dragons, it seemed, did not age and weaken as humans, and even elves did. The Blood Queen turned to face Maya, and the elf saw something in those golden eyes that transcended simple gratitude. There was recognition, as if Azura had been waiting for this exact moment for thousands of years, as if she had somehow known that this particular elf would be the one to free her. Through their mental connection, Azura shared with Maya the fact that she had sensed the elf's loneliness from miles away. She had called out to Maya through the darkness, a silent plea for help that had somehow reached across the vast distance and touched the elf's heart. Now they were bound together in a way that went far deeper than simple alliance. By freeing Azura, Maya had created a connection that could never be severed. They were linked by magic and choice and the mutual need that had brought them to this underground chamber. Azura began to shrink, her massive form compressing down until she was only 30 feet in length, a size that would still be large and impressive, but manageable enough to move through the cavern passages that led to the surface. Maya climbed onto the dragon's back, settling herself between the powerful shoulders. She was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. What they were about to do would change everything. The moment they left these caverns and revealed themselves to the outside world, the Elven Kingdom would know that a great power had been unleashed. They would hunt both of them without mercy, seeing them as a threat to the established order. But there was no turning back now. The die had been cast and destiny was beginning to unfold. Azura began to move through the cavern, her footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The dragon knew these passages well, having lived here for 5,000 years. She moved with purpose and determination, carrying her newfound companion toward the light of the surface world. As they traveled, Azura shared more memories with Maya, showing her visions of flying freely through clouds and hunting alongside her kind. The dragon was rebuilding her strength and her hope, drawing power from the knowledge that she was finally, after an eternity of suffering, about to taste freedom once more. The journey through the cavern passages took what felt like an eternity to Maya. Azura moved swiftly but carefully, avoiding the narrowest sections where the dragon's larger form might become trapped. The bioluminescent fungi that lined the wall seemed to glow more brightly as the dragon passed, as if responding to her presence. Maya realized that these plants were probably ancient remnants from a time when dragons had lived in these caverns deliberately, having cultivated them as a way to navigate through the darkness. As they traveled upward through increasingly narrow passages, Maya began to feel a strange sensation building in her chest. It was a mixture of anticipation and dread, the knowledge that everything she had ever known was about to end. She had been a part of the Elven society since birth, trained and shaped by its traditions and expectations. She had believed in its values and fought for its protection, but now that was all falling away, replaced by something entirely new and uncertain. Azura seemed to sense Maya's growing anxiety. Through their mental connection, the dragon sent waves of reassurance and calm. Azura had endured 5,000 years of imprisonment, facing each day with the knowledge that freedom might never come. Now that liberation was finally within reach, the dragon's resolve was unshakable. She projected this certainty to Maya, helping the elf to overcome her fear and embrace the transformation that was beginning to take place within her. After hours of traveling through the dark, they finally began to see light ahead. The passages opened up into larger chambers, and eventually they reached the entrance to the Forbidden Caverns. The sealed door that had been placed there by ancient elven magic still stood, but Azura walked through it as if it was no obstacle at all. The dragon's power was far greater than the magic that had been used to seal the caverns thousands of years ago. The barrier crumbled and fell away, revealing the night sky beyond. They emerged into a world bathed in moonlight. The stars shone with brilliant clarity above the shattered mountains, and the air was clean and fresh after the smoky atmosphere of the caverns. Azura took her first breath of the outside air in 5,000 years and released it in a long, slow exhalation that spoke of profound relief. Maya slid off the dragon's back and stood for a moment, breathing deeply and allowing her eyes to adjust to the brightness of the moonlight. Azura began to rise up on her hind legs, stretching her wings out to their full, impressive span. The dragon was still reduced in size from her true form, but even at 30 feet she was an awe-inspiring sight. Her wings caught the moonlight and shimmered with an ethereal beauty. Maya watched as the dragon rose higher and higher, lifting herself off the ground with powerful beats of those massive wings. For a moment, Azura hovered in the air, testing the feel of wind beneath her wings after millennia of imprisonment. Then the dragon released a roar that echoed across the mountains and valleys, a sound of triumph and liberation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Birds took flight from distant forests, startled by the noise. The sound traveled for miles in all directions, and Maya knew with absolute certainty that people would hear it. The Elven Kingdom would know that something had changed, that a great power had awakened in the Forbidden Lands. There was no longer any possibility of keeping this secret. Azura descended back down to the earth, landing gently beside Maya. Through their connection, the dragon indicated that they needed to move away from this place as quickly as possible. The kingdom's warriors would be coming soon, drawn by the sound and by the disturbance in the magical energies. Azura was still recovering her strength, and Maya was exhausted from the effort of breaking the ancient chains. They needed to reach a place where they could rest and recover before facing the inevitable pursuit. The dragon transformed once more, her form shrinking down to a more manageable size. She was now only about 15 feet in length, small enough to move quickly through the mountain passes without attracting immediate attention. Maya climbed onto her back once more, and Azura began to run, leaping down the mountainside with remarkable agility for a creature of her size. They moved through the night, traveling by moonlight and the faint glow of starlight. Hours passed as they journeyed away from the forbidden caverns and deeper into the wilderness. The landscape changed gradually, the harsh rocky terrain giving way to forested areas and eventually to rolling grasslands. Azura's breathing became heavy, her movement slowing as exhaustion began to take hold. Maya realized that even a creature of such immense power had limits, especially when recovering from such a long period of captivity and struggle. They finally reached a valley that seemed isolated and peaceful, nestled between two mountain ranges and hidden from easy view by thick forests. A clear stream ran through the valley, and there was an abundance of game animals that would be necessary for feeding a dragon of Azura's size. The dragon approached the stream and drank deeply, the water seeming to revitalize her somewhat. Then she found a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock and settled down to rest. Maya lay beside the dragon, her head resting against Azura's warm scales. She was emotionally and physically drained from the events of the past few days. She had committed an act that would be seen as unforgivable in the eyes of her people. She had freed one of the creatures that her civilization had sworn to keep imprisoned. By tomorrow morning, when the kingdom's warriors realized what had happened, she would be branded as a traitor. Her family would be questioned and possibly imprisoned. Her friends would be questioned about their association with her. Everything she had ever known would be thrown into chaos. But as Maya drifted off to sleep with her hand resting on Azura's warm neck, she felt something that she had never experienced before. She felt at peace. For the first time in her 347 years of existence, Maya felt like she had finally found her place in the world. She was no longer a weapon to be wielded by others. She was no longer a tool to be used for purposes decided by someone else. She had made a choice that was entirely her own, a choice that had meaning and purpose. Through their connection, she felt Azura's contentment as well. The dragon had endured unspeakable suffering, but she too had found something precious in this moment. She had found a companion, someone who understood her and valued her not for what she could do, but for who she was. The two beings lay together in the darkness of the valley, and something new began to take shape between them. It was the beginning of a partnership that would change the fate of the entire world. As the first rays of dawn began to break over the mountain ridges, Maya woke to find Azura staring out across the valley. The dragon was alert and watchful, her head raised to catch the scents carried on the morning breeze. Through their connection, Maya sensed that Azura could detect the presence of other creatures in the world around them. The dragon was beginning to sense the vast network of magical beings that existed beyond the boundaries of the elven kingdoms. There were other dragons, perhaps, or creatures equally powerful and equally desperate for freedom from the oppression that had been placed upon them. The first sign of pursuit came on the second day. Maya and Azura were resting in the valley when the dragon suddenly became alert, her head lifting as she caught a scent on the wind. Through their connection, Azura communicated a warning. The kingdom's warriors were coming, moving through the mountains in organized groups. They numbered in the hundreds, maybe more. The Council of Elves had responded to the incident with the kind of military mobilization that indicated they saw this threat as existential. Maya stood and climbed onto Azura's back, and the dragon immediately began moving toward the far side of the valley. They could not afford to be caught out in open terrain where the warriors would have the advantage of numbers and coordinated tactics. They needed to move into areas where the dragon's ability to fly would provide an advantage, places where foot soldiers would struggle to follow. Azura ran toward the forest and they plunged into the thick trees, moving at speeds that made Maya grip tightly to the dragon's neck. The pursuit was relentless. Day after day, the elven warriors tracked them through the wilderness. Maya realized that they were using magical tracking methods following the disturbance in the magical energies that Azura created simply by existing. The dragon was a beacon drawing attention wherever they went. They could not hide for long because Azura's presence was simply too powerful, too different from anything else in the natural world. Azura suggested through their connection that they stop running and instead prepare to face their pursuers. The dragon had been recovering her strength each day, and her power was growing exponentially as her body healed from the effects of long imprisonment. But Maya knew that even Azura's immense power would not be enough to defeat hundreds of trained elven warriors. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were elite members of the kingdom's defense force, skilled in both combat and magic, equipped with weapons and armor forged by the greatest smiths in the elven lands. They needed a different strategy. Maya began to think carefully about the situation they faced. The kingdom wanted to recapture Azura and presumably execute Maya for her betrayal. They had the advantage in numbers and coordination, but Maya and Azura had something far more valuable. They had motivation and the growing strength of their connection, and they had the vast wilderness of Valorith at their disposal, a land that stretched far beyond the boundaries that the elves had marked as their own territory. Maya suggested to Azura that they fly toward the far northern reaches of the continent, a region that was rarely explored by elves because of harsh weather and lack of resources. If they could reach those distant lands, they might find sanctuary in places where the kingdom's warriors could not easily follow. Azura agreed to the plan, and that night, as darkness fell, the dragon took to the skies for the first time in her flight form since her liberation. Flying on Azura's back was unlike anything Maya had ever experienced. The wind rushed past her face and the ground dropped away beneath them. The world transformed into a patchwork of forests and rivers and mountains, all rendered small and insignificant from such a height. Azura's wings beat with powerful, steady strokes, carrying them higher and higher into the night sky. The stars seemed closer now, almost close enough to touch. Below them, Maya could see the faint campfires of the pursuing warriors. They were moving in organized formation, trying to predict where the dragon and her rider would go. But from the air, Azura could see patterns and routes that ground travelers could never perceive. The dragon adjusted her course, flying in a direction that the warriors were not expecting. She used the darkness and her intimate knowledge of the aerial currents to evade pursuit. By the time dawn broke, they were hundreds of miles away from the nearest warriors. The landscape below had transformed into vast forests and then into grasslands and then into terrain that became increasingly barren and harsh. The temperature dropped as they flew northward, and Maya found herself grateful for the warmth that radiated from Azura's scales. The dragon was burning incredible amounts of energy with this sustained flight, but she showed no signs of slowing down or tiring. After hours of continuous flying, Azura finally descended toward a landscape of snow and ice. The continent they had known was falling away behind them, and they were entering a realm that was almost completely untouched by elven civilization. Here in this frozen wasteland they might finally find the sanctuary they so desperately needed. Azura landed on a ridge of snow-covered rock, and Maya slid off the dragon's back, her legs shaking from exhaustion and the strain of holding on during the long flight. They found shelter in a cave carved into the mountainside, a place that seemed to have been formed naturally by wind and erosion. It was not comfortable, but it was safe and relatively warm thanks to Azura's presence. The dragon's body heat transformed the small cave into something almost cozy. As they settled in to rest, Maya realized that they had finally managed to put enough distance between themselves and their pursuers that immediate capture seemed unlikely. But as the days passed in this frozen realm, Maya began to understand the true cost of what she had done. Her people would not simply give up the hunt. She had become one of the most wanted individuals in the entire elven kingdom. There were probably bounties on her head, rewards offered to anyone who could bring her back alive or dead. Her family's name had been dishonored. Her closest friends and companions were probably being interrogated about their knowledge of her whereabouts. Through their connection, Azura seemed to understand Maya's growing sense of guilt and loss. The dragon showed the elf memories of what had been taken from the dragons when they were imprisoned. Azura had not chosen her captivity. She had not asked to be separated from her kind for 5,000 years. She had not volunteered to suffer and endure while her entire species was hunted to near extinction. The elves had forced this burden upon her, and the dragon had no regrets about the liberation she now enjoyed. Maya began to see that her own sacrifice, while real and significant, was nothing compared to what Azura and the other creatures had endured. She had lost her place in society and the respect of her people, but she had gained something far more valuable. She had gained freedom and the companionship of a being who understood her in ways that no other creature ever could. She had gained the ability to make her own choices and to create her own future, rather than simply following the path that society had laid out for her. Days turned into weeks as they remained in the frozen north. Azura needed to hunt for food, flying out across the icy plains in search of game that could sustain a dragon of her size. She would return with prey, and they would feast together in the cave. During the long nights, they would communicate through their mental connection, sharing memories and stories and dreams about what they might accomplish together. Azura began to reveal her plans to Maya. The dragon wanted to journey to the great mountain range that lay even further north, a place that was rumored to contain ancient sites where dragons had once gathered and built their civilizations. If such places still existed, Azura believed she might find evidence of other surviving dragons, or at least the knowledge needed to wake them from whatever slumber or imprisonment they had fallen into. Azura wanted to rebuild what had been lost, to restore her kind to the glory they had once known. As autumn turned to winter and the frozen landscape became even more harsh and unforgiving, Maya and Azura began their journey toward the great mountain range that lay beyond the frozen plains. Azura had grown stronger with each passing day, recovering more and more of the power that had been locked away during her imprisonment. Her scales had become even more vibrant, shimmering with deeper crimsons and violets. Her wings had grown larger and more powerful, and her roar had developed a resonance that could echo across mountains for miles. Maya had also transformed, though not in as visible a way. She had become leaner and stronger from her time in the frozen wilderness. But more importantly, her mind had changed. She no longer thought of herself as a member of the Elven Kingdom, or even as an elf at all. She had become something new, something that existed between the worlds. She was a companion to a dragon, a bridge between species, a symbol of what could be accomplished when beings cast off their fear and prejudice to work together toward a common goal. The journey through the frozen wastes was perilous. There were creatures living in this harsh land, animals that had adapted to survive in extreme cold and isolation. Some of them were large and dangerous, predators that had learned to hunt in packs. When they encountered these creatures, Azura would rise to her full height and release a roar that would send the animals fleeing in terror. The dragon was not interested in wasting energy on meaningless combat. She had higher purposes now, a mission that required all of her strength and focus. One day, as they were traveling across a particularly barren stretch of frozen plateau, they came across something extraordinary. It was the skeleton of an enormous dragon, half buried in snow and ice. The bones were ancient, possibly thousands of years old, but they were still massive and impressive. The skeleton had to be over 300 feet long, far larger than Azura's current form. Through their connection, Azura communicated a profound sense of grief and respect. This had been one of her kin, perhaps a close relative or even a child. The dragon had died far from home in this frozen desolation, alone and without hope of rescue. Maya and Azura spent an entire day at the site, and the elf performed a ceremony of remembrance for the fallen dragon. She used her knowledge of ancient elf magic to create a memorial, marking the spot with stones arranged in a pattern that would preserve the memory of this lost being. Azura added her own tribute, placing her scaled hand against the ancient bones and singing a song in the old dragon language, a melody that spoke of sorrow and loss and the determination to ensure that such suffering would never happen again. As they continued northward, they began to encounter signs of other dragons. There were bones scattered across the landscape, remnants of battles and hunts that had occurred over millennia. There were also rock formations that clearly had been worked by intelligent hands, stones arranged in patterns that could not have occurred naturally. These were the ruins of what had once been dragon cities, now buried under snow and erosion, waiting to be discovered and studied. After weeks of travel, they finally reached the great mountain range that Azura had been seeking. The mountains were absolutely colossal, towering peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. They were covered in snow and ice, but Azura flew upward with confidence, soaring higher and higher until the air became thin and breathing became difficult, even for the dragon. As they climbed, Maya began to see strange structures carved into the mountainsides, structures that were far too large and too perfect to be natural formations. They finally reached a plateau near one of the highest peaks, and Azura descended to land before what could only be described as the entrance to a vast underground complex. The opening was enormous, easily large enough for a dragon the size of Azura to walk through with ease. The edges of the entrance were carved with symbols and patterns that matched the designs Azura had described to Maya from her ancient memories. This was a dragon stronghold, a place where dragons had once gathered and lived and built their civilization. The interior of the structure was vast and magnificent. The passage opened into enormous chambers that had been carved out of solid rock using methods that seemed impossible. The walls were covered with artwork and murals that depicted dragons flying through clouds and gathering together in great celebrations. There were symbols and writings in the old dragon language that told the history of their kind. And everywhere there were signs of long abandonment, dust and fallen stones and the weight of thousands of years of neglect. Through their connection, Azura shared memories with Maya. This place had been her home once, before the great war that had scattered her people. She had walked these corridors as a young dragon, learning the history and culture of her kind from the elders. She had celebrated victories here and mourned losses here. She had been happy here, before fear and war had driven dragons to desperate measures and eventual extinction or imprisonment. In the deepest chamber of the stronghold, they found something that made Azura's entire body tremble with emotion. It was a sleeping chamber, and inside that chamber were crystalline formations that held the preserved forms of dragons. They were not dead, not completely. They were in a state of magical hibernation, frozen in time thousands of years ago. Azura approached the nearest one, a large blue dragon that seemed to be a close relation based on the similarities in their features. Through their connection, Azura explained what she believed had happened. When the war had begun, and it became clear that the dragons were losing, some of them had decided to enter this form of hibernation, hoping that a day would come when the danger had passed, and they could wake once more. The magic that had preserved them was beginning to fade, and Azura believed that with the right magic and the right motivation, she might be able to wake them. Maya realized that she was witnessing the beginning of something truly momentous. Azura was not just seeking freedom for herself. She was seeking to restore an entire species that had been driven nearly to extinction. Maya felt a sense of awe and responsibility. She had freed one dragon, and in doing so, had set in motion events that might ultimately change the fate of entire civilizations. Over the following weeks, Maya and Azura worked together to wake the sleeping dragons. It was exhausting work that required both physical effort and magical concentration, but one by one the crystalline formations began to glow with renewed energy. The dragons inside started to stir, their eyes opening for the first time in thousands of years. Azura was there to greet each one, to explain what had happened while they slept, to welcome them back to a world that had changed beyond recognition. As more dragons awakened and recovered their strength, others began to arrive at the stronghold. These were dragons that had somehow survived in hiding in remote corners of the world, creatures that had learned to keep themselves concealed from the eyes of those who would hunt them. They had sensed the awakening of Azura and the others through magical resonance that traveled across vast distances. They came seeking hope and community, drawn by the promise of a new beginning for their kind. Maya stood with Azura on the highest peak of the mountain range, watching as dragons of many colors and sizes soared through the sky. Some had scales of deep emerald green, others were brilliant gold, still others were silver like moonlight. They flew in patterns that seemed almost like a dance celebrating their freedom and their reunion. The elf felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what had been accomplished. She had come seeking companionship and had found far more than she could have imagined. By freeing one dragon, she had helped to save an entire species. The fear and prejudice that had driven a wedge between dragons and elves for thousands of years was beginning to crack and crumble. A new era was dawning, an era where beings of different kinds might learn to coexist rather than to destroy one another. Azura turned to Maya, and their eyes met in perfect understanding. Through their connection, the dragon communicated a single message of gratitude and hope. Maya had given Azura more than freedom. She had given the dragon the gift of reunion with her kind, the possibility of a future that held meaning and purpose. And in return, Azura had given Maya something equally precious. She had given the elf a home and a family, and the knowledge that her existence mattered in ways that duty and obedience could never have achieved.